In colonial America, as soon as a woman married, she became the legal dependent of her husband. At least this gave her more status and power as the mistress of a household, rather than depending on family or working as a domestic. When the Founding Fathers were at Continental Congress preparing the document which became our Declaration of Independence, Abigail Adams was promoting women's rights. She wrote to John, her husband, quote, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous to them than your ancestors. If not, we are determined to foment a rebellion." End quote. John just laughed. Subtle changes were taking place. From a 1792 article in Ladies' Magazine, the author writes, "I object to the word obey in the marriage service. Marriage ought never to be considered a contract between a superior and an inferior." Nothing much happened until Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton joined forces, resolving to change the laws. They were invited to attend an anti-slavery convention in London in 1840, but were told not to speak. This was the beginning of their fight. On July 19th and 20th in 1848, 240 men and women met at Seneca Falls, New York, and organized the first convention. Later, Susan B. Anthony joined to form the National Women's Suffrage Movement, whose goal was a constitutional amendment. Meanwhile, Lucy Stone founded the American Women's Suffrage Association, whose goal was an amendment at the state level instead. Lucy spoke from the pulpit of Zion Reformed Church in Chambersburg in 1855 in her bloomers. What a scandal that was! Both movements languished because they couldn't compromise with each other. In 1890, they merged to become the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Two sisters who lived at Caledonia made inroads by devoting their lives to causes. Myra Lloyd Dock was an environmentalist, and Lavinia Lloyd Dock, a nurse who became an ardent suffragist. She spent many years at the Henry Street Settlement House with Lillian Wald, working with the immigrants in the tenements, but she continued to push for women's rights. We see her next with the suffrage pilgrimage from Albany, New York, to Washington, D.C. in 1913 to take a message to President Wilson. They reached D.C. in time for a 5,000 women's parade the day before his inauguration, which overshadowed it. At the end of November 1915, she is quoted in the local Chambersburg newspaper as speaking at the Grafenberg Inn, which appears to be Suffrage Headquarters. She joined forces that year with the radical Alice Paul, co-founder of the Congressional Union. Starting in January of 1917, they picketed the White House, standing vigil. Arrests were made for obstructing traffic, and Lavinia was jailed 3 times. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns staged hunger strikes from the jail and were force-fed at the Occoquan workhouse. Lavinia continued to speak out against World War I and social issues of the day, including better conditions for the prisoners at the jail, where our historical society is located today. The panoramic image, dated July 30th, 1914, was taken during Old Home Week, commemorating 50 years after the burning of Chambersburg. The committee in charge of the parades debated on allowing the suffragists to enter a parade, but decided against it. This caused so much controversy that the chairman, 2 days later, was forced to admit them into the industrial parade. This is the image with the original banner. The Goddess of Liberty stood in the center, surrounded by women whose states had already admitted suffrage. During the week, their headquarters was located in the Rosedale building, where they displayed literature and served lemonade and iced tea. The amendment was placed on the ballot in November 1915. Locally in Franklin County, there were 2,601 yes votes and 2,799 no votes. In Chambersburg, 852 yes votes to 907 no votes. Waynesboro was the only town that won by 153 votes. Another 2 years passed while the women worked on an amendment. In January 1918, the Susan Anthony Bill was introduced by Jeanette Rankin, the first woman in the House from Montana. The House passed it, but the Senate rejected it twice, in 1918 and again in February 1919. It was brought back to the House in May 1919 and to the Senate in June 1919. Both finally passed it, but it still needed 36 states to ratify it. Tennessee became the 36th state in the summer of 1920, which meant women could finally vote for president in November, 72 years after the Women's Rights Declaration at Seneca Falls, New York. So, do you know who won?